It was late afternoon when the young woman left her workplace, her shoulders a little heavy from the long hours she had just put in. The streets were busy with people rushing home, cars honking in every direction, and the air filled with that mix of noise and routine that often drowned out little details. She walked quickly, hoping to get home before dark, when her eyes caught sight of something unusual on the opposite side of the road. An elderly man was trying to cross, clutching 2 bags of groceries that looked far too heavy for him. His hands trembled, and each step seemed like an effort. The traffic rushed by without slowing down, and the crowd of people waiting on the sidewalk didn't seem to pay much attention. She paused for a moment, debating with herself. She was tired, her feet ached, and she could have just walked on like the others. But there was something about the man's fragile figure that pulled her forward. She didn't think twice after that. She pushed through the crowd and hurried across, weaving between cars until she reached him. His grip on the bags was slipping, and his body wavered unsteadily. Without a word, she took 1 bag from his hand and gently held his arm to guide him. The old man looked at her in surprise, his wrinkled face lighting up with a soft smile. He seemed almost relieved, as though he had been waiting for someone to notice. Together they crossed, moving slowly. The drivers grumbled, horns blared, but she stayed steady, making sure his steps were safe. When they finally reached the other side, the old man let out a deep sigh, the kind that carried both exhaustion and gratitude. He turned to her, his eyes filled with warmth, and whispered a soft thank you. His voice was weak but carried a sincerity that touched her heart. She brushed it off lightly, saying it was nothing, just a simple act. But deep inside, she felt a strange sense of peace for having stopped Dot as they stood there. She noticed how his clothes, though neat, were worn out, and his shoes looked like they had seen many years. His hair was thin and silver, his skin lined with age, yet his posture still held a quiet dignity. There was something about him that didn't quite fit with the image of someone struggling alone on the streets. She wanted to ask more, but she held herself back, not wanting to intrude. He gave her a nod, picked up his bag again, and started walking away. She watched him disappear into the moving crowd, feeling as though she had just stepped into a story much bigger than she could see. On her way home, she couldn't shake the thought of him. She wondered why no one else had bothered to help, why people had looked away as if his struggle didn't matter. She thought about how often in life people rush past, blind to the quiet battles others are fighting right in front of them. That day, she realized, had reminded her of something important. Sometimes it only takes a small pause, a small act to make a real difference. The next evening, when she walked the same path, she found herself scanning the crowd unconsciously, looking for the same old man. She didn't see him, but the memory of his grateful smile lingered in her mind. She felt curious, wondering where he lived, what his story was, and why he seemed to carry that air of mystery along with his frailty. She didn't know it then, but that single moment of kindness had opened the door to something far greater than she ever imagined. It wasn't just about helping a stranger across the road. It was the start of a connection that would soon reveal a truth capable of changing both of their lives forever. Asterisk. The following evening, as she walked home again along the same busy street, her eyes drifted almost instinctively toward the park nearby. Something inside her wanted to see the elderly man once more, though she told herself it was just curiosity. To her surprise, she spotted him sitting alone on a wooden bench under a tree. His grocery bags were gone this time, and instead he sat quietly, his posture slightly bent, his hands resting on a walking stick. The crowd passed him by as though he were invisible, but to her, he stood out as if a light was shining only on him. She hesitated for a moment. Should she go over? What if he didn't remember her or didn't want company? Still, something about his lonely figure tugged at her heart. She walked toward him and softly greeted him. The old man lifted his head, his tired eyes meeting hers, and recognition flickered across his face. Slowly, a smile spread across his lips. "You again," he murmured, his tone carrying both surprise and relief. She sat down beside him, noticing how thin his frame was, how his clothes hung loosely as if he had been losing weight. Out of instinct, she reached into her bag and pulled out a bottle of water she had carried. She offered it to him, and though he resisted at first, insisting he was fine, he eventually accepted with a quiet nod. They began to talk in small pieces at first about the weather, about how crowded the city was, about the people rushing past. His voice was soft but thoughtful, and though he spoke like an ordinary old man, there was a depth to his words that made her listen closely. As the days passed, she found herself looking forward to these meetings. Whenever she walked by, she would stop if she saw him, and slowly a bond began to grow. Sometimes she brought him a small meal, sometimes just sat beside him and listened to his quiet stories about life. He never spoke much about himself, never mentioned family or work, and he always kept details vague. But there was something about the way he listened to her that felt rare. He seemed genuinely interested when she spoke about her day, her struggles, her dreams. Unlike many people who only half listened, he gave his full attention, and that made her open up more than she expected. One evening, as the sun was setting, she noticed the way other people in the park glanced at him from time to time. A few even gave him respectful nods, though they didn't approach. It struck her as unusual. Why would strangers acknowledge an old man who seemed so ordinary? She wondered if he had once been someone important, perhaps a teacher or someone respected in the community. Still, she didn't ask. She didn't want to spoil the simplicity of their friendship by prying. Despite his fragile appearance, there was a quiet strength in him. When he spoke about life, his words carried wisdom earned through years of experience. Sometimes when she shared her worries, he gave advice that felt more profound than anything she had heard before. It was as if he understood struggles beyond what he revealed. Yet, at the same time, he carried a sadness in his eyes, a weight he didn't put into words. The young woman noticed how others around them mostly ignored the old man, walking past as though he were just another shadow in the crowd. But to her, he was becoming a part of her daily life, someone who reminded her that kindness had no limits, that small gestures could grow into meaningful connections. One night, as she got up to leave, the old man thanked her with unusual sincerity. "You may not realize this," he said softly, "but what you're doing matters more than you think." She didn't quite understand what he meant, but his words stayed with her long after she went home. Little did she know, their simple bond was slowly weaving into something extraordinary. The kindness she had shown a stranger was leading her toward a truth that would change everything she thought she knew about him. The mystery of who he really was lingered quietly, waiting for the right moment to come forward. A few more days passed, and their friendship grew quietly. The young woman often found herself changing her path just to pass by the park bench where the old man liked to sit. Sometimes he was there, sometimes not, but when she saw him, it always felt like a little relief, like meeting someone she could trust without effort. He was never demanding, never asked for anything, but she always brought him small things, bread, fruit, or warm tea in a flask. He accepted them with a humble smile, always saying, "You don't need to do this," though she could see how grateful he truly was. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, he asked her if she could walk him home. His legs were tired, he admitted, and the road back felt longer than usual. She agreed without hesitation. Holding one of his grocery bags, she walked slowly at his side, making sure his steps were steady. They moved through quieter streets until they reached a modest apartment building. The building itself looked ordinary from the outside, but when they stepped inside, she felt something unusual about it. The hallway was silent and neat, and as they passed, she noticed a man standing near the entrance in a crisp suit. At first, she thought he was just another resident, but the way he stood alert, watchful gave off a different impression. He nodded politely at the old man, and the old man nodded back. She wondered briefly if it was a security guard. But she didn't ask Dot when they entered his apartment. She expected to see the usual signs of old age clutter, old furniture, or piles of forgotten belongings. Instead, she noticed something else. The place was clean and simple, yet certain details caught her attention. On a shelf rested stacks of folders neatly arranged, some with official-looking seals she couldn't quite make out. On the wall, there were framed certificates and photographs, though most were turned in a way that made them hard to see clearly. She caught glimpses of groups of men and women in formal suits, some shaking hands, some standing at podiums. She tried not to stare, but her curiosity stirred. Who exactly was this man? Why would someone who seemed so frail and lonely live in a place filled with such official-looking documents? She thought about the suited man at the entrance and began piecing things together, though nothing made sense yet. The old man noticed her wandering eyes but said nothing. Instead, he offered her a seat and thanked her for walking him home. He poured her a glass of water with steady, practiced hands, as though he had lived a disciplined life. They sat quietly for a moment before he began speaking about simple things again: his health, the city, the way people hurried through life without seeing one another. He always spoke as though he was trying to remind her of deeper truths hidden in everyday routines. At one point, she gently asked him about the papers on the shelf, her voice cautious so as not to sound intrusive. He smiled faintly, shook his head, and said, "Old memories. Nothing important now." His tone closed the subject, but his eyes carried something heavier, something unsaid. She respected his choice and didn't press further. Still, the mystery of his life grew larger in her mind. As she left that evening, she noticed the suited man still outside the building. He gave her a quick look, not unfriendly but sharp, as though he was assessing who she was. It sent a shiver down her spine. She walked away, clutching her bag tighter, questions swirling in her thoughts. Why would an elderly man who lived so modestly have someone watching over him? Why would his apartment hold such official documents and photographs? That night, she couldn't sleep easily. She replayed every detail: the nod of respect people sometimes gave him in the park, the quiet dignity he carried, the bodyguard-like man outside, and the files stacked neatly on his shelf. The pieces didn't fit together yet, but she knew one thing: the old man was not who he seemed, and though she didn't realize it, her kindness had already placed her in the middle of a story much larger than she imagined. The truth of who he was lingered close, waiting for the moment it would reveal itself. The city was restless that week. Rumors had been spreading about a heated dispute in the neighborhood, something involving a proposed development project that threatened to displace several longtime residents. The young woman didn't usually pay attention to politics or community debates, but the tension was hard to miss. Flyers were plastered on walls, people gathered in small groups, arguing in hushed tones, and local news vans often parked on street corners. Still, she never imagined she and the old man she had befriended would somehow be connected to all of it. One evening, as she walked toward the park, she noticed a large crowd forming near the community center. The air buzzed with frustration, people raising their voices, demanding to be heard. Curious, she moved closer. To her surprise, she spotted the old man standing among the crowd. But he wasn't hunched or weary this time. He stood taller, his cane resting by his side, his presence suddenly commanding. For a moment, she almost didn't recognize him. The noise grew louder. Reporters scribbled in notebooks, and cameras began to roll. Then, in the middle of the chaos, a local official tried to calm the people down, but was quickly drowned out by shouts. Just when it seemed like the situation might spiral out of control, the old man stepped forward. His voice, though calm, carried weight. "Please," he said firmly, "let's listen to each other." The crowd fell silent almost instantly, as though his words carried an authority no one could ignore. The young woman stood frozen. She had never heard him speak that way before: clear, powerful, confident. She watched as people turned their attention toward him with respect, some even nodding in recognition. The suited man she had seen outside his apartment now stood nearby, scanning the area carefully, confirming her growing suspicion. Then the moment of truth came. A journalist, clearly recognizing him, addressed him loudly. "Councilman, do you believe this project should move forward?" The word hit her like a wave. Councilman. Her heart skipped a beat. She glanced around, wondering if she had misheard, but the way others reacted told her it was true. The old man she had been helping all this time was no ordinary stranger. He was a powerful federal councilman, a man whose decisions shaped lives and policies. The crowd erupted again, but this time they directed their voices toward him, asking for guidance, pleading for fairness. The councilman raised his hand, and once more the noise settled. His words came measured, full of wisdom and empathy. He spoke about justice, about protecting those who had no voice, about leadership being rooted in service rather than power. His speech was not long, but it was enough to calm the anger, enough to remind people that someone in authority still cared. The young woman's mind spun. She thought back to the day she first saw him struggling with groceries, the way he had sat quietly in the park, the way he had listened to her so intently. How could she have known that behind those tired eyes was a man with such influence? He had chosen not to reveal it, living quietly, observing life as an ordinary person. And yet, he had allowed her kindness into his guarded world. As the meeting ended, the councilman stepped down from the front, and his eyes found hers in the crowd. There was no arrogance in his look, only warmth. He gave her the same humble smile she had seen before, as if to remind her he was still the same man she had helped across the street. In that instant, she understood something. Titles and power didn't erase his humanity. To her, he wasn't just a councilman, he was the man who had reminded her how important compassion was. Walking home that night, she felt both stunned and proud. Stunned that she had unknowingly been helping someone so important, and proud that her small act of kindness had meant something to him, even before she knew who he was. She realized the truth was not just about his identity, but about the fact that kindness never goes unnoticed, no matter who receives it. But deep down, she sensed this was only the beginning. The revelation had changed how she saw him, but it also left her wondering what role she was meant to play now that she knew his truth. The following days felt different. The young woman couldn't walk through the streets without hearing people mention the councilman. His words at the community meeting had spread quickly, and the local news replayed his speech over and over again. Yet every time she saw his face on the screen, she felt something private, something the cameras would never capture, the memory of the frail old man struggling with grocery bags, the man who had quietly shared water and small talks with her on a park bench. One morning, she decided to visit the park again. She half expected he wouldn't be there anymore, too busy with official duties after being recognized so publicly. But as she approached, she saw him sitting in his usual spot under the tree, cane resting against the bench, looking like any ordinary elderly man enjoying a moment of peace. Relief washed over her. Despite everything, he hadn't changed where it mattered. When he saw her, his face lit up with that familiar gentle smile. "I wondered if you'd still come," he said softly. She sat down beside him, shaking her head. "Of course I would." "You're still you," she replied. He chuckled at that, a warm laugh that carried both gratitude and humility. They talked for a while as if nothing had changed, but there was a new depth in the silence between them. Finally, he turned toward her, his expression more serious. "You should know something," he began. "When I first met you, I was reminded of why I chose this life of service. People often think power is about influence or wealth, but it's really about never forgetting the value of compassion. You showed me that when you helped me, not knowing who I was. That kind of kindness is rare, and it's what gives me strength." His words made her throat tighten. She had never thought of her small actions as anything extraordinary. To her, it was simply the right thing to do, helping someone who needed it. But hearing him place so much meaning on it made her realize how even the smallest gestures could ripple into something much greater. Later that week, another gathering was held at the community center, this time organized by the councilman himself. Curious, she attended. The room was filled with residents, reporters, and officials. She stood quietly at the back, watching him address the crowd. He spoke passionately about fairness and listening to the voices of the people, but then, in the middle of his speech, he paused. His eyes swept over the room until they found her. He raised his hand and called her forward. The audience turned as she froze in place, her heart racing. Reluctantly, she stepped toward him, unsure of what he was about to say. When she reached the stage, he placed a hand gently on her shoulder and spoke into the microphone. This young woman reminded me of something that too many of us forget. In a world where people rush past one another, she stopped. She chose to help a stranger, not for recognition, not for gain, but because it was the right thing to do. And that act of kindness reignited my purpose as a leader. She showed me that real power begins with compassion. The room erupted in applause. She felt her face flush, overwhelmed by the attention. She had never expected her small deed to be noticed, let alone honored in such a way. Tears stung her eyes, but she held her head high, realizing the truth of his words. Kindness was powerful, not because it demanded anything, but because it touched lives in ways unseen. Afterward, people came up to her, shaking her hand, thanking her for inspiring them. She didn't quite know how to respond, still feeling like an ordinary person who had simply done what anyone should. Yet, deep inside, she felt changed. She understood now that her actions had meaning beyond what she could see, that one choice to care could ripple outward and affect countless others. From that day forward, she carried herself differently. She didn't see herself as a hero, but she no longer doubted the impact of compassion. She continued to visit the park, continued to look out for those who seemed invisible in the crowd, and continued to believe that every act of kindness mattered. As for the councilman, he remained her friend. Their bond never turned into one of power and authority, but stayed grounded in simple human connection. Sometimes they sat in silence on the bench. Sometimes they laughed about small things, but always, there was mutual respect. The truth she had discovered wasn't just that the man she helped was a powerful leader. The greater truth was that compassion had the power to bridge the gap between strangers, between ordinary and extraordinary, between the powerless and the powerful. And in that truth, her life had been forever changed.